So good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second of the 7 talks in the Introducing Buddhism course. And just to remind those of you who may have missed last week's course that we started by speaking about what is Buddhism, and we said it was the teachings of a man, an individual called Siddhartha Gautama, who lived around 2.5 millennia ago, and we talked about his life as a very privileged prince, and how at the age of 29 he decided to leave his life of luxury behind and set out on a journey to find the root cause of suffering and the path that would lead to the end of suffering. And through that journey, he became Buddha, he became awakened, and he laid open a path that we can all follow. And what the Buddha said was he'd merely rediscovered an ancient way to an ancient city and left that path open for the rest of us to follow behind him. And I finished last week's talk by saying you can read about Buddhism and think about Buddhism, but if you want to walk that path and find the truth that the Buddha discovered, then you do have to set out and do it. You can't just think about it, read about it, hear about it. So Buddhism is a practical religion to be experienced rather than learned about. It's something for you to experience. So tonight we're going to move on to some of the things that the Buddha taught, and the title of tonight's lesson is 3 Signs of Being and 3 Fires. But before I get on to that, I'm going to give you a couple of bits of reading that you might like to have a look at. Now, I know there's a very long reading list has gone out with your course material, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of books here. The one on the left is very simple, quick read. You can read it in the course of an evening or 2 evenings. It's a very, very clear, simple overview of Buddhism and what the Buddha taught. And on the right, a book by a modern day Tibetan Lama. And this is basically about the Noble Eightfold Path, which is something we're going to talk about in detail further down the course. But this is a very, very nice book. It's got not only the teachings, the Noble Eightfold Path, but it's got some meditation practices that accompany each of those various steps along the path. So these are both books that I would recommend for beginners. But if you want to get further into Buddhism, there's a much longer reading list, which you will find in your course materials. So we'll start by reminding ourselves of what the Sanskrit and Pali word Buddha actually means. It means one who is awake, one who is enlightened. And the man who became Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, became called the Buddha when he achieved that moment of enlightenment, having sat for 8 days under the Bodhi tree in meditation. And the body of the teachings that the Buddha gave has come to be called the Dharma, but the word Dharma really comes from a very old Sanskrit and word with a much older Vedic root. And Dharma really means not just the things the Buddha taught, but it really refers to the nature of things, the way things really are. And if you look at where the word derives from, it derives from words that mean support, that mean a way of living, a moral compass, if you like. So the Dharma refers to the true nature of how things are, as opposed to the way we perceive them. But it is also the nature of the Dharma is that it supports us towards leading a more wholesome, a more skillful life. And the Dharma the Buddha's teachings are often shown in this form as of a wheel with 8 spokes, and that is basically referring to the Noble Eightfold Path, which again we'll talk about more in some detail. But you'll see this symbol as a symbol for Buddhism that's fairly widely used. I want to talk, before we start the bulk of tonight's talk, I want to give you another teaching story. This is a very famous story told by the Buddha. It's probably one of his most famous stories, and it's called The Parable of the Raft. And the Buddha was teaching this to his monks, and he said, imagine that there's a fast-flowing river, and there is a man on this side of the river, on this bank of the river, and on this bank of the river is danger. This is a dangerous place to be. The far side of the river is where safety lies. So what should the man do? Well, he collects materials from around. He collects wood, and he collects twigs, and he collects some pieces of bamboo, and he starts to fashion a raft, and he binds it together and makes it all secure. And then he floats the raft into the river, and using his hands and his feet, he exerts himself, and he paddles that raft across the river to the far side, to the bank where there is safety. And then the Buddha said, but then, monks, what should the man do with this raft? Do you think he should pick it up and carry it round on his back as he goes off across the ground? No, he should lay it down. And it's the same with my teachings. Once they've been used for their useful purpose, you lay them down. You don't carry them around with you. So this is a very interesting story told by the Buddha, because of course we are on the shore of danger. We're in the world of delusion, the world of suffering, and the Buddha's teachings are a way of getting us over to the far shore, to the shore where there is a cessation of suffering, where there is safety. And we do need to exert ourselves. We don't just sit on the raft and float happily across the river, otherwise we'd end up swept downstream. We do have to put in some effort. Reach that place of safety, then we lay the teachings down. We don't need to carry them along with us. We don't cling to them. So this is one of the Buddha's teachings of non-attachment, which we're going to talk about a bit later this evening. Even the Buddha's teachings are not things to be clung to. Once they've served their useful purpose, we lay them down and go on our way. So let's get into the substance of tonight's talk. We're going to cover some important core Buddhist concepts tonight. And the first ones we're going to talk about are the 3 signs of being, the 3 marks of conditioned existence. Basically, these are the 3 things which are the nature of everything. And I'm going to talk about those in a little bit of detail, but I'll show you first of all what we're talking about tonight. So 1 or 2 of them are really very obvious things. So impermanence or change. Nothing is permanent. Everything changes to one extent or another. Everything is, for that reason, partly for that reason, unsatisfactory. There is unsatisfactoriness or suffering or discomfort at the heart of all compounded things. And then the third one, which is a little bit more tricky to get hold of, is that everything is empty of any intrinsic self-nature. So let's talk about those things. Now, the first one, impermanence or change, is very obvious, and this is not even a particularly Buddhist concept. I've put a quote here from the Greek writer Heraclitus: "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it is not the same river, and he is not the same man. So we all know that everything is subject to change. The weather changes from moment to moment. Buildings start to deteriorate and decay. We ourselves change. We know that everything is in a constant state of flux. If you've studied physics, you'll know that things are made of atoms, particles whirring around. If you've studied biology, you know that our very cells are dying and dividing and new cells are being made. We're in a constant state of change. So why then, if this is so obvious, why do we struggle so much with this? Well, the reason we struggle so much with it is because we don't mind things changing if they're things we don't particularly like very much. But if it's things we are attached to, things that we regard as being pleasant or beautiful, then we don't actually want them to change. We want them to stay the same indefinitely. So here you'll see the lovely rose, which is withering and dying. We'll see how we ourselves change. So here's Brigitte Bardot, a very attractive young woman on the left, and to my mind, still a very attractive older woman on the right. But we don't like the idea that we age, that we lose our looks, that we lose our health and our fitness and our beauty. That makes us suffer because we actually don't really want those things to happen. And even things that we think are relatively fixed and permanent, buildings, mountains, all of these things are subject to change. So change is around us and is innate in everything. Nothing is permanent. But because we, through our deluded way of seeing things, cannot see this and cannot accept this, this causes suffering. And there's a parable which really points to this, and it's a very, very old teaching story, and some people say it comes from, it's of Persian origin, and other people say it's of Yiddish origin. But essentially the story relates to a king, and in this particular version it's King Solomon. And King Solomon wanted to set a test for one of his courtiers, who was a rather arrogant man who needed to be taken down a peg or two. And King Solomon said to him, I want you to bring me something that will have the power to make me happy when I'm feeling sad, and to make me sad when I'm feeling happy. And the courtier went off to think about this and struggled to find this wonderful gift that would make King Solomon happy when he was otherwise sad, and sad when he would otherwise be happy. And it said that he went away and struggled with this for a year. And then eventually, a year to the day when he'd been set the challenge, he came back to King Solomon and he offered him a small gold ring. And King Solomon looked at this and thought, is he making fun of me? What does this mean? And the courtier said, look more closely. And the king looked closely, and inside the ring was written in beautiful script these words, this too shall pass. And that was the gift that had the capacity to make King Solomon sad when he was happy, and happy when he was otherwise sad. And the king realized that all of his wealth and his power and his privilege would not last forever, that everything was subject to change and decay, and all would be lost. This too shall pass. The second of the three signs of being is one we've met already, suffering. The Buddha taught suffering, I teach, and the way out of suffering. Now, lots of people get confused by this word suffering, and they think, oh, there you go, you Buddhists, you're always going on and on about suffering and misery. But the word for suffering, dukkha, encompasses a much broader thing than merely pain or distress. Suffering really encompasses all that is unsatisfactory in life. So from distress, from pain, from misery, depression, grief, right through to the just niggling irritations about how things don't go the way we think they should go. Just that general sense that all is not right in the world. Things are not as they should be. And this intuition that things aren't quite right and that something should be different, I think troubles most of us, and is probably what brings most of us into a religious practice and towards a Buddhist practice, the notion that something isn't quite right. That general sense of dis-ease, discomfort, dissatisfaction. It's there nagging away at us, that sense that something isn't quite right in our lives. And that is really one of the intrinsic parts of our existence, because things are not permanent, because everything is subject to change. It is intrinsically unsatisfactory. And the Buddha summed this up in one of his sermons. He said, well, what is suffering? What is dukkha? Birth is dukkha. Aging is dukkha. Death is dukkha. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are dukkha. Association with the unbeloved is dukkha. Separation from the loved is dukkha. Not getting what is wanted is dukkha. So that sense of suffering, of dissatisfaction, of discomfort relates to not having what we want, not being able to get what we want, having to lose what we want, not being able to keep what we want. It relates to having to put up with things that we don't want, not being able to avoid those things. And because we have this deluded sense that my likes and dislikes are the most important things, and that really life should go the way I want it to go, intrinsic to our nature is suffering. So those two signs of being are really self-evident. It takes very little thought to recognize the nature of things that are to change, and the nature of and that constant change means that things are intrinsically unsatisfactory. But the third of the three signs of being, this one is a little bit more difficult to grasp. And it's at this point, usually in the course, that people get a bit cross and say, no, I'm not having that, and go storming out. So if you're going to storm out now, don't slam the door. But this is one of the more tricky bits, is that what the Buddha taught is that not only are things impermanent and unsatisfactory, but everything is empty, that nothing has any intrinsic, unchanging self-nature, including ourselves. Now, this is actually a very difficult concept to grasp, because we have a very strong sense of self. So I believe that I exist. I'm sitting here inside of my skin, and everything outside of my skin, out there, is other, is not self. And therefore, I am different from you. What's mine is mine. What's yours is yours. And I'm going to defend what's mine till the bitter end. And this is the cause of a great deal of our deluded way of seeing things and our suffering. So how can it be that there is no self? Because I feel so very keenly that I am here, I am a person, that someone is sitting here inside of this body. There's someone here talking to you, and someone inside of you is listening to me. But if you give this a little bit of thought, you will start to see that we are not special and separate and something substantial about us. So the analogy I often use is the analogy of speed dating. Now, most of you on this call will never have done speed dating, I'm sure. I certainly haven't. But in speed dating, you have 2 minutes with a stranger to introduce yourself to them and tell them all about yourself. And they decide in that 2 minutes whether they like you or whether they want to have a date with you or not. And I want you to just ponder in your minds, if you had 2 minutes to sum up yourself and tell that person, let's suppose that person can't necessarily see you, what would you say about yourself that was absolutely crucially the essence of you? How would you describe yourself in 2 minutes? And for example, I might say, well, I'm 57, I'm blonde, I'm 5'4", I work as a doctor, I like doing this, I like doing that. But once you start unpicking all of those things, none of them are actually true. I mean, yes, I'm 57 now, but the last time I was talking to you last week, I was 56 because I've just had a birthday. Am I blonde, or is this actually, it's grey, isn't it? 5'4", the last time I got was measured, I was actually 5'3.5". I lost half an inch at some stage along the way. The things I like today may not be the things I like tomorrow. So actually, when I start unpicking this me, this special thing that I'm going to sell to you in 2 minutes, I can't actually find anything substantial that is there that distinguishes me from the next person you're going to meet at the table, because everything I'm describing is impermanent, is changing, and is not necessarily going to be true in a day, a week, a month, or a year's time. I can't find anything substantial to tell you about myself. I'm just describing things that are going to change. But we have a very strong sense that there is a person, there is somebody at home, that there is a ghost within the machine. If you look at this face, you all know who this person is. This is a very famous person. This is Barack Obama. You can all see that. But when you look closely, it isn't a face at all, is it? It's lots and lots of different colored squares. It looks like a face. And we are similarly beguiled into thinking that because there is a voice, there's someone speaking, that there is a speaker, because there is sounds are being heard, that there is a hearer, that there's actually a little mannequin, if you like, sitting up here controlling what's going on. An ego, a self, I, a soul. But what the Buddha said was, no, there is no such person. There is simply what you are. And I'll tell you what we are in a second. But just before I go on to that, you can't just say, okay, there's no self, because it's a very, very powerful delusion. Just as I'm sitting here now and saying there's no white triangle on that screen, and yet you can see it, can't you? You can see it, you can see it. And it's an illusion, and you know it's an illusion. Intellectually, you know it, and yet you still see it, don't you? And similarly, if I say to you, there is no self, there's no ego, there's nobody home, you will say, yeah, I feel there is, there must be, there must be, there must be. So what actually are we then if we don't have an intrinsic self? What is the nature of human existence? Well, the analogy here is of a cart, and here's a nice diagram of a cart. You've got a yoke, you've got a drawbar, a shaft, a crossbar, some wheels, some spokes. If you dismantle the cart and take apart all of those bits and lay them out on the ground, where would the cart be? Do you see? The essence of cart is only really present when all of these things are together, all of those component parts are together. Once you start taking all of the bits and pieces apart, the cart has gone. And it's the same for human existence. And this is, in Buddhist teaching, this is what human existence is summed up as 5 aggregates, or the Sanskrit word is skandhas. Skandhas means a heap or a pile. Think about those little piles of spices that you see laid out in Indian markets. So we are made up of 5 aggregates, and they are these: form or matter. So that's the material body, that is my flesh, my bones, the material nature of me. Feelings or sensations, the things that I sense coming in from the outside world through or the inside world actually, from my various sense organs. We'll show you what those are in a second. Perceptions, so the sensation coming in and I recognize it. I recognize this as a flower or that as a bird. The recognition of whatever it is that I'm sensing. Thought processes or mental constructions or mental formulations, the whole thought process that goes along once I've seen and recognized whatever it is. And then finally, consciousness. So I'll show you how that is supposed to work. But before I show how that's supposed to work, I'll just go a little bit further into the senses, because I said the sensations or feelings. In Buddhism, there are 6 senses. There are the 5 that we are familiar with, so smell, sight, hearing, touch, and taste, but also mind and mental objects or thoughts themselves are sensed. And so the 6th sense is the sense of the mind sensing those thoughts and the thought processes that are going on. So there are 6 senses in Buddhism, and how they fit together within the construct is as shown here. So let's say that I'm seeing with my eye. This is the object of, this is the thing with which I see visual, I pick up visual sensation. I see an object. In this situation, it's a flower. So my eye, that's part of my body. That's the material form. I see the flower. And then there is the light that strikes the back of the retina and sends those impulses down those nerve cells into the brain. That's the process, the sensation of seeing, the process of perceiving the flower, and that comes into my brain and forms the mental object, which I then recognize as a flower. So I've seen the flower, I've got consciousness that the flower is there, and then the mental formulations start to kick in. I say, oh, that's a pretty flower, or oh, that flower needs a bit of water, or oh, that's a really ugly color. And then I go off on a little daydream about what that flower means to me. And I'll give you another example from my own experience. I was having a walk in the Norfolk Broads a couple of years ago, and it was a lovely hot day, and I was wearing shorts. Now, I have a strong allergy to insect bites, so I swell up if I get a bite and get very itchy. So I'm walking through the Broads, having a lovely time, and suddenly I feel, so my body, I'm aware of a sensation of a tingling or a prickling sensation down on my leg. So I had a look down, and what do I see? See with my eye, I saw the thing on my leg, and it was a mosquito. So immediately I perceived the mosquito, I recognized what it was, and the sensation was there, and it was rather an unpleasant one. And then it went up into thoughts. Oh no, it's a mosquito, it's biting my leg. I'm going to get a big swelling there. It's going to be itchy. It's going to be painful. Whose idea was it to have this stupid walk in the first place? Why did they not warn me? I could have worn my longer trousers. I could have put on insect repellent, blah, blah, blah. And suddenly off we go into a long chain of thoughts and recrimination and annoyance and suffering. Now, the point of the story is that there doesn't need to be an I, a me, in the middle of all that. There was simply my body, the mosquito, the sensation of the bite, the recognition that I'd been bitten, and then the thought process that followed about how that was going to turn into an annoying, swelling, itchy mess, and da 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 da. There didn't need to be somebody inside of me up here in my head to be coordinating all of that. It was simply a sensation, a recognition of what was causing that sensation, a recognition that it was an unpleasant sensation, and then lots of thought processes that took on forward from that about how I was going to suffer as a result. So those are the 5 skandhas, and we're going to come back to those again and again throughout the course, and why this conviction that there is an I sitting at the center of all of that, directing things, is such a powerful and yet an unhelpful delusion. So now we're going to move on to the next part of tonight's talk, which is the 3 fires, or the 3 passions. So these are the things that get us fired up about life and cause us to suffer, actually. And the reason these are called fires is because this arose from a sermon given by the Buddha. It's called the Fire Sermon. And he said to his monks, this house, in other words, your body, this house is on fire. It's burning with the fires of wanting, the fires of hating, the fires of delusion. There is no abiding in such a house. So what did he mean by that? Well, he was referring to these 3 fires, these 3 poisons, these 3 passions that drive us towards suffering. And these 3 are greed, or clinging, or desire, or attachment, hatred, or aversion, or dislike, and then delusion, or ignorance, or an inability to see things clearly. And these are represented in Buddhist in Buddhist mythology as these 3 animals, which I'll tell you more about later, and we're going to meet them later in the course. So let's talk about the first of those 3 passions first. This is greed, or desire, or attachment, or craving, or clinging. There are lots of different ways of translating that. So what is it that we desire? What is it that I desire? Well, I can desire all sorts of material things. I might want money. I might want wealth, power, a stable relationship, happiness, all sorts of things that I want. I might want good things. I might want happiness, truth, wisdom, peace for the world. But it's not really what I want. It's the fact that I want it so badly that causes me to suffer. And it's not just things that I don't have that I want that drive this suffering, but also me trying to cling on to things that I have that I don't want to let go of. So clinging to things, attachment to things, is also an intrinsic part of why I suffer. Some of you may remember the story of Charlie Gard. So this was a few years ago at Great Ormond Street. Charlie Gard was a little boy who was born with a fatal disease that was incompatible with life. He was going to only live really a few months because he was going to suffer from brain injury and muscle injury, and ultimately he would die. And of course, this was a terrible tragedy, and his parents were desperate to do whatever they could for Charlie. So they found a man in America who had a fairly experimental therapy, and they wanted to get Charlie over to America to have this experimental therapy. But it was already a little bit too late, because Charlie really didn't have much chance of getting as far as America. And the Great Ormond Street team said, no, he's already suffering, and to try and take him away and do this treatment is not in his best interests. And the parents did all that they could, but in the end, they took this to the High Court, and the High Court ruled in favor of Great Ormond Street. But by this stage, the public had got to know about this, and people became incensed that Charlie was going to be allowed to die, that Charlie was not going to be allowed to have this potentially, life-saving treatment. These are people who never met either the child or his parents, and they barricaded the hospital. They sent hate messages and death messages to the staff. And it was a very, very difficult time. And the point of this is that these people wanted something that was a good thing. They wanted Charlie to live, but they wanted it so passionately, so vehemently, that they were prepared to inflict pain and suffering and perhaps even hurt, physically hurt other people in order to achieve what they wanted. And this was where wanting can lead us into trouble, because we can want something so badly that we become blinded to the consequences of what our wanting is causing to people around us. I'll say a few words about clinging, because this is not wanting something that you don't have. This is clinging to things that you already do have. And in the Buddhist teachings, there are 4 things that we cling to. So we cling to sensual pleasures, the things that we like, that make us comfortable in our lives. We cling to our own views and opinions. And this is a very important way in which we can cause suffering to other people. We cling to rules, rituals, and observances, and this is a trap that you can very easily fall into when you get into a religious practice. And then finally, this clinging to this very strong sense of me, I, me, and mine. So those are, in Buddhist terms, the 4 things that we cling to. Moving on now to the second of the 3 fires, we're moving on to dislike or hatred or aversion. And this is very obviously the opposite side of the coin from wanting and clinging and attachment. So these are things that we dislike and we would rather like to get rid of. Now, this is not to say that you're not allowed preferences. Clearly in Buddhism, we're allowed to prefer tea to coffee. And this is intrinsic in all of us, that we have certain likes and dislikes and preferences. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the compulsion to get into a rage if you have to have the thing that you don't want, or the compulsion to become in a spiral of despair and gloom if you have to have the thing that you don't want. Because unfortunately in life, we are surrounded by things that are not comfortable for us, and we can either accept that, or we can, as in this cartoon, retreat from it all and say, no, I can't be bothered unless it's all going to go my way. I'm not playing. And dislike can become very dangerous indeed. This is actually a group of actors, but you can see how this could very easily be an angry mob, even a football crowd. And I often think about this when I think about there are certain teams who are not allowed to play in front of a crowd because their various supporters would literally fight, hurt, and even kill each other. So Millwall and West Ham come to mind. It's a football match. What's that all about? But the fans get so passionate about their dislike for the opposing fans that it can lead to trouble. It can lead even to violence. And in fact, football fans have been killed, as you probably know. So we like things and we want to keep them. We dislike them and we want to get rid of them. And this is all driven by a fundamental delusion, an inability to see things the way they really are. So because we lack the wisdom to see things the way they really are, we have this very strong sense of I, this very strong sense of me and mine that is separate from you and yours. And I'm going to defend what's I, me, and mine from you, even at the expense of your life or my life. And we need to overcome this deluded way of seeing things. And unfortunately, the ability to learn how to see things the way they really are can be quite a difficult journey and quite painful for us all. This idea that actually there is no I, and therefore there is no me or mine, and that I am simply a bundle of sensations, perceptions, and thoughts that may be a slightly unwelcome thing at the beginning. So the little animals that I showed you earlier, these are important they're an important part of the Buddhist really painter tradition and teaching tradition. So we'll see these little animals later when we look at the wheel of life. But essentially the cockerel, greed is represented by the cockerel, which is constantly pecking through the dirt looking for seeds and food. Hatred or anger is represented by the snake, which is hissing and furious. And ignorance or delusion is represented by the boar, which goes through the dirt, throwing up the dirt with its tusks, throwing the dirt into its eyes. And in this picture, you can see that the little animals are chasing each other round and round this wheel. And what this is showing us is that delusion or ignorance leads to liking and craving and greed, and also leads to aversion and hatred and dislike. So these three fires are intimately connected together. One leads to the next, which leads to the next. And so it goes on and on and on, sending us round and round and round this unsatisfactory loop. But there's a way out of it. So the Buddha, as I said last week, like any good doctor, he not only gave us the problem, which is that we suffer, but he diagnosed the cause of our suffering, and he gave us the way towards the cessation of suffering. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the Four Noble Truths next lesson. And at the end of all of this, the cessation of suffering is Nirvana. And the Buddha talked about this in these terms. He said, there is, monks, an unbecome, an unmade, an uncompounded. Therefore, there is an escape from the born, the become, the compounded. In other words, an escape from the existence that we find ourselves in now, where everything is subject to change, decay, and suffering. And Nirvana, the word means blowing out. Think about a candle being extinguished, and it's really the blowing out or extinguishment of those fires, those passions, the fires of wanting, hatred, and delusion that cause so much suffering from us. There is a way in which that can be ended, in which we can start to see things clearly, and we can lose or transform our attachments, our likes and our dislikes, and we can reach that further shore, the safe shore at the other side of the river, which is the shore of Nirvana. And we're going to find out in the next series of talks what is the way to get from this shore, the dangerous shore full of likes and dislikes and suffering, to the further shore, the safe shore. But I'm going to set you some homework because, as I said, Buddhism is a religion to be practiced and experienced, not just to be thought about and read about and heard about. And so I'm going to give you some exercises to do during the course so you can try out some of the things that we're hearing about and experience them for yourselves. And the first exercise I would like you to do is a very simple one indeed, and that is this. I want you to choose a bedtime, a time for going to bed. I don't mind when it is, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, midnight, 2 a.m. It doesn't matter. You choose the time that you're going to go to bed, and then I want you to follow that. So decide when it's going to be and then do it. And I want you to just simply observe what happens as you do this. Just observe what happens. And we will hear a little bit more about that when we next speak. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to remind you all that next week is a bank holiday, so we're going to have the week off from the class. So the next course will be 2 weeks today, and we've got about 15 minutes for questions. So if anyone has any questions, I'm very happy to have a go at answering them.
Thank you, Rachel, for this very interesting lesson. I cannot see any question in the chat. Not sure, maybe some will arrive soon.
They're all stunned into silence, worrying about the no I.
Okay, some questions are coming now.
I can see some hands going up, yes.
So many people saying thank you, and they really like listening to you, Rachel.
I think Ursula has her hand up. Would you type your question, Ursula?
Thank you. And in the meanwhile, I can read some questions from the chat, which I now have. So the first one is related to your exercise and is from Jill. Do you mean stick to the same bedtime, or can this vary by day?
Stick to the same bedtime. Well, just I'm really getting at setting a timetable for doing something, and let's make it simple. So let's make it something that we all do every day. So make it a bedtime, and it has to be the same time every day. You can't say, well, Friday it's this day a time and Saturday it's this time. Let's make it the same time every day and just do it. And the point really is what happens when you try to do that. Observe what happens.
Thank you. Then we have two questions from Namo, who's asking a link between preferences and hobbies and attachment. And then he's also asking, can you then like something but not too much?
Yes, you can have likes and dislikes. So if I want to have tea in the morning because I prefer having tea to having coffee, then that's a perfectly legitimate thing. But if you happen to make me a cup of coffee and I get into a fury and either throw it across the room or more likely go into a moaning, grumbling, oh, he knows I like tea and yet he makes me coffee, you can see that I've started to set up a chain of suffering there that didn't need to come. You know, yes, I prefer tea, but I'll drink the coffee, and I certainly won't, if you've made me a coffee, moan and fuss and grumble and resent you for it for the rest of the morning. So likes and dislikes are fine, but when they become strong, when you start clinging to the things you like and driving away the things you dislike, then the fires have started to burn.
Thank you. The next question is from Sue, who's asking, how can we let go of this sense of self?
Well, you can't do it through an act of will. That's the problem, because that is I trying to get rid of I. So you can't simply say, I don't want any more to do with it. There's no I anymore. That's like looking at that picture and refusing to see the white triangle. It's impossible to do that, because the more you try to drive that away through an effort of will, the more you're enforcing, you're strengthening that sense of I. The way that we start to reduce that strong sense of I is we start grinding it away by, first of all, by trying to not be motivated by this I, me, and mine, this need to protect, to defend, to look after what is mine and stop you getting at it. But also through meditation, if you look closely within meditation for the thinker, the doer, the one who is seeing, the one who is hearing, then they're not there. You have to, if you properly look and say, right, where am I? That it disappears. So you can directly experience that sense of no I through meditation practice. But what we try to do in our daily life practice is grind away at that strong, passionate urges to have what I want, to refuse to have what I don't want. It has to be really ground down through, essentially through not getting what I want, and accepting it, accepting the way things are. It is a long journey, and how long it takes you to get there depends really on how diligent you are at recognizing when that sense of I has got a hold of you. There are some more direct routes to seeing into it through meditation practices, particularly within the Tibetan school of meditation. But for many of us, we simply have to let those feelings slowly dissipate over time through learning to accept what we don't want and accept that we can't have what we do want, and little by little letting that strong sense of I dwindle.
Thank you. How are we with time? So it's okay.
Yes, we've got
7:24.
A few more minutes. Yeah.
There's a question from Kat who's asking, how does one love without attachment?
How do you love without attachment? Well, love, compassion, generosity, wanting good for other people does not have to be associated with a sense of clinging and wanting to keep that person's love all for yourself. You know, you can love somebody in a more generous, open-hearted sense. So we're not trying to get rid of our emotions altogether in our Buddhist practice. We're simply trying not to be overcome with them. So I can like you, I can love you, I can want the best for you, I can wish you all happiness in the world. But if that starts to become me clinging to you, me wanting your individual attention, me taking things that you're not really willing to give me, you know, your time, your energy, etc., then that's now straying more towards that I-centered, egoistical, driven attachment that the fires are started to burn. But yes, you can love someone and wish the best for them without having any selfish notions of attachment within that. It's certainly possible, but we have to be careful. When we're first coming into the practice, of course, we are very selfish and I-driven, and it is very easy to cling on to things. But yes, it's certainly possible to love someone and wish the best for them without having any selfish motivation behind it.
Thank you. The next question is from James, who's asking, can you say something about how Buddhists can become attached to Buddhism as a religion?
Oh, I can. Ever such a lot. Well, it's very easily done, isn't it? And that's one of the clinging to rites and rituals that we are warned about. I'll give you an example. Actually, one of my teachers told me this example, that he was at a party. The people hosting the party were Buddhists, and I think it was out in the garden or something. Anyway, it came to a certain point in the evening, I don't know, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, whatever, and all the hosts of the party said, oh, we've got to go off and meditate now. What's that about? You're hosting a party and you're going to go off and meditate. Ridiculous. So yes, you can become so obsessed with the ritual, with this is how I do things as a Buddhist, that you become very, very hidebound and difficult to be with. And that's why one of the things we're taught to do when we're doing our Buddhist practice is have occasional days off from it. So we were always taught in the Zen school to have one day off a week, and at Christmas time and Easter time get to have 7 to 10 days off from the practice. So those are days when you don't sit in meditation, you don't read any Buddhist books, you just live your life in a normal way. Because otherwise you can become very grim, very rigid, very much attached to, this is how I'm doing my practice. And then suddenly it's my practice and this is how I do it. And I'm going to do it even if it's going to make you uncomfortable, because you're all sitting in the garden waiting for me to come back, because this is when I go to meditate. Very easily we can get totally attached to our practice and rigid about it. And that's, again, the fires are burning when we start to do that. And we've got to be aware when it's going the other way. If it's time for me to sit in meditation and someone's at the door because they want to deliver a parcel, or my neighbours come round with a box of chocolate brownies. I have a lovely neighbour, she cooks beautiful cakes. I'm not going to say, actually, I'm meditating, go away. That would be ridiculous, wouldn't it? You've got to be, do what's appropriate at the time, and that doesn't necessarily mean I'm doing my practice to the exclusion of everything else, because that would be equally wrong. So yes, clinging to rites and rituals, clinging to our practice is also one of the is part of that greed, attachment fire that we're trying to extinguish.
Thank you, Rachel. Do we have time for a last question?
One more, yeah.
Thank you. So the next one is from Lisa, who's asking, how would the concept of non-self fit with psychological concepts of individual differences and personality?
Well, I mean, we are different and we have personalities. I do things in a certain way. I have likes and differences. But what I'm saying is that there is no self, there's no I inside of this. I used to, when I was a kid, there was a cartoon called the Beano, and in the Beano was there was this cartoon called the Numbskulls, and it was inside someone's head. There was someone was looking at the pictures coming in through his eyes and reading the thoughts and posting suggestions into a suggestion box, things he was going to say. This idea that there's someone up there running the show is very powerful, but there doesn't have to be. It doesn't mean that I don't have a way of behaving and a way of speaking and things that I like and things that I don't like. But what there isn't is someone sitting up here above my eyes directing all of that from within. That's the delusion that we need to weaken and see into, to see clearly. Yes, you can be a person, you can have an identity, you can have likes and dislikes and habits and skills, but you don't have to have a little mannequin inside of the skull which is separate and driving all of that forward. There is no such thing. It's a delusion, and we will eventually see into that, and it will lose its allure for us. But it takes a lot of practice to get to that point. I'm going to suggest that we draw it to a close now, because it's just gone past. So as I say, next week we are having a week off because it's Bank Holiday Monday, and then we will return the following week, and we will go into some core Buddhist teachings now. We'll go on to the Four Noble Truths. So thank you very much indeed for listening, and I'll see you all in a fortnight.